Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Targeting Africa, the U.S. is expanding its covert military and intelligence operations across the continent. This is being done, we are told, under the pretext of fighting terrorism. Is Africa again being colonized by outside powers? To crosstalk the U.S. military in Africa, I'm joined by my guest in Washington, Ivan Eland. He's a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. James Mittleman, he is a university professor of international affairs at the American University. And Peter Pham, he is the director of the Ansari Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Ivan Eland, if I can go to you first, is the U.S. militarizing Africa?
Oh, I think very definitely, and I think the primary reason is oil. Africa was never regarded as a strategic continent. It might have been the only continent in the world that wasn't regarded as strategic by the military. And I think now what we're seeing is that more and more U.S. oil comes from Africa, and the U.S. military has essentially become a oil protection force if you look at where they're deployed and that sort of thing. And so I think definitely, and when they're worried about China going in and getting some of the oil contracts, which to me is a mere commercial transaction and shouldn't really worry anybody. But I think the U.S. military is orienting more toward Africa with the Africa Command and everything else, principally because of the oil.
James, what do you think about that? I mean, we're told the pretext is to fight terrorism. Do you buy it?
I think that is the pretext. I add a little bit of perspective here. There is a continuation of certain aspects of Cold War policies. The arms trade is a major issue. The United States is the largest arms trader in the world. It does 30% by export value. Russia, Great Britain, France, Germany, China are also part of the big six for the arms trade. So today there is a continuation of Soviet and American policies with Russia, the United States doing arms trade. But yes, it's about oil for the United States. Yes, it's about containing China. And this is done under the banner of a war on terror.
Okay, Peter, where do you come in on all this?
Well, I agree that Africa is increasingly a strategic importance to the United States, but let's get some facts straight first. For example, if the pursuit of terrorists was merely a cover for pursuing and defending oil interests, the U.S. would certainly not have gone to bat to bring about the independence of South Sudan, where 80% of the Sudan's oil reserves are found, and which goes almost exclusively to China. The interest would be far more in the western part of the continent, Nigeria, Algeria, where the U.S. does purchase its oil. On the weapons sales, certainly the U.S. is a major arms source of arms globally. But for most African countries, U.S. arms are not affordable. U.S. systems are too complex. In fact, the U.S. military, in a number of cases, has sourced weapons for allied countries to the former Eastern Bloc, or even looked at China as a source, simply because those weapons are far more affordable and easier to maintain for these countries.
Can you explain to my audience what the mission of Africor is? Africom? What is its mission?
The mission of the U.S. Africa Command is like that of all the 6 geographic commands, is to have planning purposes and military-to-military relations with countries in specific regions. Formerly, Africa was divided into 3 different commands. Part of it was handled out of the Pacific, part of it was handled out of the Middle East, and the majority handled out of Europe. That didn't give Africa the focus or the specialized attention it needed within the military. So those 3 subparts were put together in a specific command to take Africa on as a whole.
What is Africa? What is it supposed to do? What is Africa Command supposed to do? Peter, I want to stay with you. What does it do?
It's supposed to coordinate U.S. military-to-military relations, what has been going on before. I wrote a study a couple years ago saying, been there doing that. It really just subsumes military-to-military cooperation, training, equipping, things that were done long before the Africa Command was created. It now does it together in a coordinated fashion, bringing bring it together under one.
All right, Ivan. It sounds like me. Is it the United States? They want the United States to have Africans kill other Africans in their interest. That's what it sounds like to me.
No, this is more
Ivan first. Ivan first. Go ahead.
military.
Ivan first. Go ahead.
Well, I have to say that Africa was split up in these commands, and it wasn't given much emphasis because nobody really cared about it, frankly. And now all you do is you hear the commander and other people in the command itself talking about what are the threats to oil, right? So I think oil is a major factor in this, and we can't discount that. I don't know as we're trying to. The United States is trying to have Africans kill other Africans, but certainly we have all these military training programs with special forces around the world, and that's kind of what ends up happening. We want geopolitical influence for oil and other reasons, but what happens is a lot of the time, unfortunately, all this training goes to repressing internal revolt. And we say that we're instilling democratic values, but you can't do that in a seminar or a training course or whatever. So these militaries take the military training, but they don't always have human rights and democracy in mind. So I don't think the U.S. has this idea that we're going to set Africans against each other, but unfortunately, I think sometimes that's the end product of it.
James, you wanted to jump in there? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I want to jump in and say that it's more than military and military. Let me quote Vice Admiral Mueller of Africom. He said, protecting the free flow of natural resources from Africa to the global market is one of Africom's guiding principles.
Okay.
End of quotation. So Africom started during the Bush years. It's continued and expanded during the Obama years. Today, what has happened is that military assistance and other types of aid have become intermingled. The military, U.S. military is helping with immunizations, with health issues. The number of military personnel working on Africom far outnumber the number of Department of State and USAID officials. According to one of my sources here in Washington, it's 7-to-1 military personnel opposed to Department of State and USAID. I mean, clearly what is happening is that U.S. foreign policy is becoming very heavily militarized in various parts of Africa.
Peter, how do you respond to that? Because that was my first question. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think, again, it's a matter of looking at the data and looking at it carefully. For example, Africom does have in headquarters approximately 1,400 personnel, but those are personnel based in supporting roles in Germany, in Stuttgart. On the continent, at any given moment, Africom has probably fewer than 1,500 military personnel, many of them in and out on rotations of short periods of several weeks or even days in training exercises and other functions. So when one compares that to the number of personnel in diplomatic missions and U.S. aid in any given country, at any given point, except when an exercise is taking place, it's very hard to make the case that military personnel outnumber diplomatic and development assistance personnel.
Okay, well, I mean, it is kind of interesting.
Well,
and hold it, if I could say, in 2010, $763 million was allotted to Africa Command, whereas the State Department's Africa Bureau operational budget had $226 million. I mean, how would you respond to that, Peter? I mean, it certainly the military is much more important, I guess.
Well, no, if you look at the military, it has to do all of that with the $600 million you quoted. The State Department, that's only the operational budget. When you add in the aid budget, the budget for Millennium Challenge Corporation, other things, you get a far larger budget. It's just simply parsed in several different pots. One has to look at the aggregate rather than singling out the budget that goes simply to embassy personnel salaries and maintenance.
Okay, Ivan, if I can go back to you, I mean, is the United States sending China a message here that Africa is a strategic interest of the United States? I guess the whole world is America's interest, but Africa specifically in this case.
Well, I think, yes, they're worried about China, but China's activities are mainly commercial. And that really shouldn't threaten anybody because, frankly, when the Chinese government goes out and tries to develop oil sources that aren't really commercially available, it's just a subsidy to all us consumers around the world. So their state-owned oil companies really don't operate necessarily on the market-based principles. So a lot of times that's what they're doing. They're trying to lock up all these long-term oil contracts, but that really doesn't affect U.S. security at all. And I would challenge anybody to say that it does. Any economist will tell you that the supply is just reordering whatever. I think, in the larger context, if we measure people on the ground or whatever, but the problem with the U.S. military is it has all these builds all these relationships, gets everything ready to go, and then it has a swing force that can sent to anywhere. And I think U.S. foreign policy has become very militarized across the board. And just because, if you don't have a lot of people on the ground in Africa, you can get them there very quickly, the way our expeditionary military works. So I think we've shown that we're going toward the military solution on a lot of different things. And if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, there's no question about worldwide that the U.S. has become more militarized over time in its foreign policy. And I also would add to one thing. I think in terms of U.S. security instead of U.S. empire, this is very bad because now we've created the problem in Somalia of people trying to attack the U.S. when they weren't really trying to do that before. Somalia has always been a mess, but we always seem to make it worse every time we go in there.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Africa's militarization. Stay with RT.
There are those who desperately need it to survive.
These oil companies, they can give money to one local chief or one government official, and it suppresses the cries, the rights of the people. So it's neocolonialism.
Those who don't get their share of the cake.
Every day by that race, $1 million, but nothing, one naira self. The community nearby the terminal do not achieve anything from the company, from Mobile.
And those who suck it out to prosper.
It's sad, you can say it's unfair, and probably not proper, but life is not fair.
No one can live without it. In one of the largest blood banks in the world. Blood of Nigeria on RT.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand, RT's live broadcasts, and RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about the neo-colonization of Africa. Okay, James, being an expert on Africa, I mean, how do the Africans feel about this, about the United States coming in, jockeying for power, and training its military for clandestine operations, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, do you have any information whatsoever what the people on the ground think? We always know what Washington thinks, but what do the people on the ground think?
Well, there are governments who want U.S. military assistance and who gain from this. They're able to use military patronage within their own countries and to try to stabilize the situation. but most Africans want local solutions. Take northern Uganda, for example. I lived in Uganda for 2.5 years. Their religious leaders and other civil society groups are clamoring for internal solutions, not external solutions, to the problems that exist. At this point, General Petraeus over at the CIA is authorizing special operations. There are drone attacks, assassinations taking place in Central Africa today. Oftentimes, African governments are not notified before this takes place, but people want internal solutions. Also, the Africa Union is involved. The Africa Union has special negotiators there. It's the U.S. role to support internal solutions to these problems, not to militarize them. More violence does not solve violence. Innocent civilians get caught in the crosshairs.
Okay. Peter, what do you think about that? I mean, what does the United States want to do? Does it want to have all of the governments of Africa on the same page when it comes to military threats and those kind of things? It seems rather odd to me. Why doesn't the African Union just take care of itself?
Well, in fact, the U.S. policy would be favorable, in fact, would encourage the African Union to take more ownership of these issues. But the fact is, it's not fully capable, and in areas where it in fact has reached out, for example, in Somalia, where the African Union Mission Force has been, in the last 2.5 years, greatly assisted by U.S. and European militaries in building up its
Peter,
capacity.
if the African Union isn't willing to do it, why then should the United States do it? I mean, the United States,
not, two points.
Why should it be determining
Peter,
that?
Go
right
points.
ahead. Go ahead.
Let me answer that. 2 points. First, the African Union is willing, but it's not capable. There's a difference between the willingness to do something and the ability to do so. Secondly, in some cases, even if it were not willing, and those are few and fairly far between, the U.S., as any other great power, has its own interests, and those interests give it a right to act in the defense of those interests. Now, in Central Africa, we have instances where, at the invitation of local governments, the U.S. has actually gone in where it does not have a direct interest. Northern Uganda, James's example, the Ugandan military, along with that of the Central African Republic and the so-called Democratic Republic of the Congo, have been unable to deal with Joseph Kony for the better part of 2 decades. And it's at the request of these governments that the U.S. has sent in a modest force of special operations forces.
A lot of people would say, just to reverse, Africom Command in this ridiculous story about Kony 2012 and all of that is just an invitation to advertise the militarization of the continent. What do you think about that, Ivan?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I'm not sure why Kony is a strategic interest of the U.S.
Yeah, I agree.
And when we say the U.S. is a great power, and we have the right to defend our interests, the question should really be from U.S. security is, what are our vital interests, and are they really in Africa and chasing around Kony or anybody else, right? Are they even in Somalia combating the Shabaab? We're just making more likely that somebody will attack the United States, right? There are things that we don't really need to worry about, and unfortunately our foreign policy elite doesn't seem to think that there's any place. Africa used to be the only place where we really didn't care about it, the strategic community didn't care about it, and Africa was probably better off for it. But I think this idea that we even say this in NATO, our rich allies, well, they just don't have the capability to do it. Well, if you continue to do stuff for countries, they're never going to get the capability to do it. If somebody pays your rent for you, why should you pay it, right? I mean, that we face this with rich allies in NATO, so of course we're going to face it also in Africa. But the real question is, are our vital interests in some of these places, and why the heck are we there, right? Why not get out?
Peter, you want to react to that? Let Peter first.
Okay.
Peter first.
It's very simple. I think Ivan misses the bigger point. The bigger point is you can't have allies who you only call upon when it affects you, and you don't come to their assistance when they want something. Now, in the case of Uganda, northern Uganda, let's finish that example.
We have drones.
Because
we have drones. In an era,
we have drones.
In an era, drones can't do everything.
Defend New York if a bomb goes off there? No, they're probably not.
No, let me finish.
You can't
Okay.
get the NATO allies to do that.
Would you mind letting me finish?
Go ahead,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Go ahead, Peter.
The fact is that we have allies, and allies occasionally need favor. 100 special operations forces to help the Ugandans and others hunt down Kony. It's not a vital interest, but it's a vital interest to them. That's what friends are for. If we only call upon them whenever we need them, but don't respond when they need us, don't be surprised that we don't have many friends in international settings. So I think it's a very simple. It's a vital interest to them, not to us, but we recognize that. That's why they're a partner.
All right, James, jump in. Go ahead.
Okay, who are the allies? Fact is that many of the allies are undemocratic regimes, and they are militias that are being funded by the United States. This is not in U.S. vital interest. There's a bill up in Congress right now to authorize more troops to go into northern Uganda and the Central African Republic. This follows making of the viral video, Kony 2012. Millions of dollars have been devoted to this by private citizens. Kony is not in Uganda at this point. It's a local band of criminals who have gone elsewhere to other African countries. The policy on the ground there is one of reconciliation. It's of amnesty. U.S. vital interests are to facilitate the development of Africa, to correct the poverty, to correct the inequality. Africans have to do this themselves. Development is an internal matter. Let development happen. Many African economies are growing quite rapidly now. According to a recent IMF report, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. Not all of that is commodity driven. Much of the wealth from commodities is being diversified, and industrialization is taking place. For the United States, it should be hands-off, except to support negotiated settlements internally and to give assistance to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and to UNICEF to rehabilitate people in war-torn areas.
Peter, if I can go to you, one of the concerns I have with this whole idea is that, I said earlier to get Africans to kill Africans. What I meant by that, I should have been more clear, is that you have basically allies in there, American allies in the region and on the continent, and you get them to do things for you so Americans don't have to die. Americans don't like it when soldiers die, but when other people's soldiers die, they don't really care about it. That's what I'm getting at. Using that as an alliance on the continent to go after American interests, protect American interests.
Well, certainly, and part of that, I agree with you, Peter, on that. And part of that, however, requires building up their capacity, training them, and although I know some of my friends here are skeptical, in fact, Human Rights Watch reported just last month that the U.S. training mission in Uganda has actually helped rein in and professionalize the Ugandan military in several aspects. Is it perfect? Far from it. But is it an improvement over what was without those 100 special operations forces? Certainly. And so part of training up includes deploying small units for training purposes to fill in capacity gaps and to bring them up to a level where Africans can take ownership. And I agree fully with James. The big story in Africa is development and economic growth, but the precondition for either of those two is security. And in all too many places in Africa, regrettably, security has to be established first, then we can build up.
Okay, Ivan, what do you think about that? I still don't understand why the United States has to make Africa safe.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we can't afford this. I'd like to bring some domestic reality to this conversation. We run wars in Libya, which are not in our strategic interest or whatever, and we have a $1 trillion budget deficit, and something has to be cut. And we may have draconian budget cuts if the Congress and the President don't do something about it. So, which is going to cut back the military capability. And even if we don't have the drastic cuts, there's still going to be cuts. And I think we need to start prioritizing what are in our vital interests, what are not so vital, et cetera. And I just don't think we can afford this kind of stuff anymore. And the second thing is, Look what we've done in Yemen and in Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban they didn't even exist before we went into Afghanistan. Now they're attacking the U.S. with terrorist attacks. The same way with the people in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Well, if we go into Africa, what about the Shabab? I mean, there's a lot of Somalis that live in Minnesota. Do we get retaliatory terrorist attacks there? How is that increasing our security for these? It's great to have allies, but we need to know why we're having allies places. We don't just, the U.S. just goes out and tries to get as many allies worldwide, and that was the superpower days, the Cold War days. And we don't really need to do that anymore. And I think we need to be a little bit more careful where we're intervening and who we're helping because we may be making people mad.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to give you the last word on the program. Blowback, that's what we just heard. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think you do it by partnering with countries, being clear and transparent about our mission, doing it intelligently. I agree with Ivan. You can't do everything to everyone, but one has to assess the cost benefit. And in Africa, it's a very minimal investment. The figure you cited, $600 million. With the budget cuts, it's going to be a little slightly less than that. That's to secure a continent that is soon to be home to 1 in 4 of the world's workers, the supplier of about a quarter of America's energy imports. It's certainly a very small investment.
Jump in here. We always end up on the note of oil here. Many thanks to my guest today in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, Crosstalk rules.